You're listening to Liberty USA, sponsored by County Citizens Defending Freedom. As an American, you have freedom flowing through your DNA, and we are here to help educate, empower, and encourage you to stand for your freedom.
Welcome to Liberty USA. I'm your host, Lindsay, and today I have Nick Caturano, a Disney cast member, in the studio with me. Nick, welcome to Liberty USA.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thanks for having me. Excited about talking today.
I have to ask, is your last name Italian?
It is. It is. Caturano with the three fingers. Caturano.
Do you cook Italian food a lot?
I do. But my wife has taken my recipes and kicked them up a notch, so I leave the cooking for her most of the time.
How nice of her.
Right.
Go ahead and give us some background on yourself.
Well, I got involved in all this activism and fighting. I work at Disney. I've been there about 17 years now. I was involved with the union. I was a union leader. I negotiated a lot of things with Disney directly in committees. I've always been fighting for people on one aspect or the other. I've done a lot of advocacy work. But when the mandates came, I decided, I through a few experiences with my wife and I getting COVID, literally we got early warning that the mandates were coming. Disney was one of the first companies to announce the mandates. They wanted to be leaders of the pack, and they are leaders in the industry for a lot of things. But as I heard the mandates were coming, I voiced, when the union reached out for my opinion, knew that I would be the dissenting voice. I gave them all the reasons why I was against it. But there was nothing I thought I could do. And when my wife and I got COVID, literally my wife tested positive the next day. 2 or 3 days later, I tested positive. And through my experience with that, going to the hospital, being sent home till I go into crisis, there were nothing that they could do for me. Learning about the FLCCC protocols, taking ivermectin, erythromycin, and a steroid, and getting better right away. I was really surprised that this wasn't out there in public knowledge. And as I looked into it and dug into it, I stumbled across Dr. Pierre Corey's talk before the Senate in December 2020, warning them about their treatments in the hospital and the remdesivir and ventilators, and the idea of ivermectin being successful, that he had seen all these results. I put it all together, and I watched what they were doing, and I came to the conclusion that they were mass murdering people, and that really created a resolve in me to take a stand. And Ephesians 5:1 was kind of like my mantra, I would say, or my guiding light. Have nothing to do with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. And that's how I got involved in all this.
It's interesting that you brought up ivermectin, because the first time that I went to purchase ivermectin, my prescription was $3. I then had COVID, used it. Ivermectin worked wonders. I was negative within 5 days. Went to get a refill, and all of a sudden I'm paying $200 for the same subscription within a couple months.
Yeah, and I think that's on purpose. I think all of it's on purpose. I think you can't get it really except for compound pharmacies. And I noticed that same thing with my mom. When my stepdad got sick, we had it ordered in over there. We paid $250 just for a small amount, where a few weeks prior, or when me and my wife were sick, I think it was like $13 for a whole cycle. So it's crazy. It's just, the whole thing's insane.
I think it's rude too, because some people can't afford to pay that.
Right. I think that's part of it. It's putting the pressure. It's incentivizing not going in the right direction. So instead of incentivizing early treatments and successful therapeutics, they're incentivizing the protocols, which basically says go in the crisis. We have a ventilator and remdesivir waiting for you in the wings. There was a lot of incentive for that, and people made a lot of money as a result of it. And I think the incentive, too, is to get people into the shots, and that's incentivized by a lot of money. Somebody's paying for it, and we're all paying for it. So it's crazy. We're paying for everything, right? Inflation, they're giving out money, they're doing all these things, and at the end of the day, the taxpayer is paying for it with our taxes, but we're also paying for it through the inflationary process. That's a big tax.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back. Walk me through being at Disney. You just heard these vaccine mandates were coming down. What was your first step of action?
I remember the conversation. We were visiting family in Sarasota that was visiting from California. There was a big discussion because everybody was vaccinated. We were unvaccinated. There was a little bit of uncomfortability of us visiting. I got the phone call. I took the phone call and was pacing the garage talking about how I felt. But I said it's a runaway train. I seen the mandates coming. There's nothing I'm going to be able to do about it, but I'm just going to give my voice of I disagree with it, and these are the reasons X, Y, and Z. And then when my wife, like I said, my wife tested positive, I tested positive, and then we got better. We took ivermectin alone, and 2 hours later we felt better, and 2 days later we were fine. And I realized, wow, this is insane. Thinking about all the people that had died and why they weren't allowed to take this and why the drug was demonized. Hydroxychloroquine was demonized. My aunt has lupus. She took it for 8 years. 8 years of taking hydroxychloroquine will bring you problems like any drug. But it wasn't, there were hundreds of thousands of people on this hydroxychloroquine. It's been on this, they give it out like prophylactically in the jungles. And yet they had demonized it to the point where you could do nothing else, and people were scared to take it or take ivermectin, and I just realized there was a bigger agenda at play, and then just seeing how the horse dewormer Joe Rogan, soon after I had gotten sick and taken ivermectin, he had taken it, and we know the false reports out of Oklahoma, which those stories were debunked, that people were ODing on ivermectin from horse dewormer, and I just saw it just really, we've been watching the media unfold and propagandize us on so many things politically and conservatively and with the riots and everything. But when I saw that real clearly, my eyes were open and I couldn't unsee what I saw, and I had to fight. I had a sense, an obligation to do something. And that's pretty much what I've been doing, just trying to do something. So how did you fight it? Well, being in the union, one of the things we did, we started a food bank. When the unemployment wasn't coming through and people were out of work and people were going hungry, literally, and there was a lot of panic. People didn't know how long this was going to last, what was going to happen. One of the good things we did with our union is we started a food bank. We started shopping ourselves and building these packages, and it went from 200 people to thousands of people. Oh, wow. And as a result, I ended up doing a lot of press. They just started coming out there. I was naturally good at it for whatever reason. I couldn't, and they started coming from around the world and coming to my house. And I remember CNN coming to the house, and it was just like constantly doing a lot of press with it. Would they show up at your house? No, they would call. They would That's call. Nice of them. Right? Yeah. It was a positive story. They were there to talk the positive story about what we were doing. So I figured, I had these press contacts I had made, and they were friendly press contacts. I don't know how they were going to react to this. So I thought I'm going to, I didn't at first blame Disney. I figured they were in a hard place. So if Disney, if they didn't go with the mandates, I imagine there would be a lot of blowback as well because it had become so politicized. So I was literally thinking I could write something and give all the data and everything I had saw, and I felt like I could reason with Disney and try to give them a way out, try to encourage them to make the right decisions on this, and then I would reach out to the press. But later on I would realize the press wasn't friendly at all on this subject, so I had a big uphill battle. But there was a Dr. Ben Rawl. He's a chiropractor in Kissimmee. I was a client of his. He did a health conference and brought in a lot of these doctors in Del Bigtree. So I went there, and I was surprised by Steve Maxwell was there to speak. I heard his speech. I was really inspired, really encouraging. It answered a lot of things and a lot of concerns I had. And I called up CCDF and I said, well, I'm really interested to get involved. I don't know how it'll work, but I want to get plugged in. Let's see where it goes. So I got on a thread with CCDF, and everybody was communicating on there about what's going on, what we're doing. And I just expressed, here's my situation at Disney. Disney's early to the mandate thing. I'm going to write an open letter. And I don't know what to do, but I'm going to try to reach out to my press contacts and see what happens. And Steve, who I didn't know personally, I wasn't even sure if it was the same Steve I heard spoke, to be honest with you. He just says, when you're ready to do that, we'll back you up. I didn't know what that meant. Mm-hmm. But that started the relationship with me and CCDF and our fight against Disney. Was there a point in your life where you realized that
God was taking you down this path in media?
Yeah. I was a DJ for years, so I got no fear talking in public. I'll share a story. I did a what do they call that? Bible school, Sunday Bible or Bible camp, and I taught the kids. And the pastor said, "Would you mind talking about your experience?" And it was a large church, about 2,000 people. I'll never forget getting in front of that crowd. And my mind was willing, but my body started to tremble from my right leg up, and I could feel my whole body trembling. And I just kept talking, and finally the tremble went down. I didn't realize how scared it's little, like different between body and mind. But that fear of public speaking left, and it's left me ever since. And then being a DJ and speaking, people have asked families to speak at funerals, and little by little. And then when I had all that press experience during the food bank, and I told my wife, I said, I feel like God's preparing me for something, but it's not this. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what
That's incredible.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And as you begin to look back, when God's leading your life and you begin to walk in obedience and submit, you begin to see it unfold, and you can look back and you can see clearly, like, wow, he's been leading me the whole way.
It's been really cool to watch your journey and how God has used you and will continue to use you in the future. So you're fighting the vaccine mandates. You're connected with CCDF. What comes next? What was the outcome of partnering with CCDF to get Disney to drop the mandates?
Well, Steve had his offer. I was going to write this op-ed, but then I saw the urgency for early treatment. So I wrote, hadn't done anything like this before. So I wrote a document, I guess we'll call it, did a PDF. It took me a few days to do it for early treatments so that I could circulate and send it to everybody, because everybody was asking me, what'd you do? How did you do it? And I put in as much information. And then I turned my attention to writing this open letter. And it turned out to be like 21 pages long. And it was all this detail. And I reached out to Steve and said, I'm ready. Are you still is the offer still stand? He said, I'll call you in 10 minutes. So 10 minutes later, I was on a call with him and Jeff Childers, who I didn't know. But it was a really great call. I mean, out of my realm, out of my pay grade, I would say. And we just started talking about what was next, what the options were, what the possibilities were. The next day, I think we were talking to CJ Wheeler, who's our media contact, and the three of us on the call. Steve came up with the idea of a website. 2 days later, we had the website up and going.
And what is the website?
GoofyVaccine.com.
There it is.
That was Steve's idea.
I love it.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know how that's going to fly along, but it's worked out great. And the next thing you know, we were off and running in a lot of interviews. Big media has blocked us out, but literally we were doing interviews around the world, and word was getting back to cast members in Orlando and Disneyland from interviews in South Africa and England and Ireland. So it started a whirlwind. It brought attention. It woke a lot of people up. It brought a lot of opposition, but that was the start of it. And I think it brought us the results. It helped put the pressure on for the special session, which ended the mandates in general, but unfortunately left the door open for discrimination. It's a little frustrating, but it was great to see a lot of jobs and a lot of the bleeding stopped.
So where are you at with Disney now and the discrimination?
Well, the discrimination has still gone on. It's what I felt from the beginning. People have been fired for taking off their mask. A lot of people were fired. Unfortunately, in a lot of these things, the help comes a little bit late. I think Jeff Childers had wrote that Wilton Simpson, who's the head of the Senate, held up the special legislation for 5 months. So when the deadlines came, a lot of people were fired and let go. They never got their jobs back. And then the N95 mask, and Disney keeps shifting, and they don't do anything in writing, but I just got a call on the way here. As I walked in the building, I was talking from a mom in Oregon who her daughter is here for the Disney college program, and they're worried she can't breathe. She's having panic attacks with an N95 mask, and I was giving her counsel, and she's trying to decide whether to just fly her daughter home tomorrow or should she stay and fight. So we were talking about that. But we were organized. We have attorney Rachel Rodriguez now, who really feels strongly about the case, and we're working on getting funding. and we're going to take on the discrimination and fight back. I think we're, in her words, we're ripe now to fight the discrimination. We have plenty of examples and plenty of good testimony to push that forward.
Well, I know you know this, but we're both seeing the effects of the masks and the vaccines play out. Do you ever just stop and think, we need to stop this madness? And how are people not waking up to see?
You know, I think we're all wondering that. You know, it's amazing how, you know, they normalized a lot of things. You know, when you're seeing kids getting myocarditis and getting blood clots and getting sick, and they'll have, I've seen bus advertisements saying your children get myocarditis and blood clots too, have them tested. And what they're doing is they're kind of normalizing these things like it's a normal thing, kind of like before older people just take pills. You just accept it. You know, I'm getting older. I'm going to take my cholesterol, my high blood pressure, and all these things. And they totally disconnected from reality that maybe you're eating things that you shouldn't be eating. Maybe your lifestyle needs to change. So I think that's part of the idea. So they normalize these things. And I have an interesting story. And if he hears it, you know, God bless him and open his heart. But you know, my wife has a client we consider a good friend. He got his booster. He went to work. He had a stroke. Since then, he's lost a lot of weight. He's going to all these doctors. They can't figure out what's wrong with him, but he's still telling my wife she needs to get her vaccine for everybody's safety. So there's just this disconnect, and my op-ed originally, I said, you know, my wife and I were just waiting for the data. We were waiting, you know, we'll see how this goes. If it works, great. We're hopeful it's working. But all of a sudden, a few months later, everybody was safe and effective, and it became like this cult. It became religious, and you were either in the right side of things or the wrong side of things. And I think once people stepped out in faith into that cult, it's been total faith, and you can't bring them back from that ledge. And that's part of the insanity. And I always think of that scripture in 2 Thessalonians where it says, because they receive not a love of the truth, God sends them a strong delusion so they'll believe a lie. And I don't know if that's the case with this, but if you look at all the people in the fight, I noticed 99% of the people in the fight for medical freedom, religious freedom, all these things, we're all Christian. I mean, I'm meeting them from all over the place. I would say 99% of the people who are in the fight for mandates, for masks, for all these things, most of them are not Christian. They're totally involved or for this whole progressive agenda and CRT and abortion and every other thing that's an abomination or ungodly. And it just seems to all kind of come together. And it's really interesting to me. And I think of it also in biblical terms as a student of biblical prophecy. You look at, and when leading up to the mark of the beast, you have the image of the beast and you have the image of Christ. You have two choices there. And Daniel, the king, saw the image of these world kingdoms as a statue of all these precious metals. But Daniel saw those same countries as wild beasts. And in the composite of all those wild beasts in Revelation 13, those are all those world kingdoms leading into this beast system. The difference with God really, he gives everybody freedom of choice. When Jesus came, he didn't coerce people, he didn't manipulate people, and ultimately his goal was to win everybody over through the biggest sacrifice and act of love anybody's ever seen. Coming from heaven, giving his life, laying it down for us, and freely offering it to us without coercion. But man without God always wants to be God. He wants to play God. That was Satan's thing, right? He wants to win people over and create this masterpiece of a world system without God. Well, he can't do it because he can't do it like God's way, because God owns that. He created it. He's delivering it. So Satan has to do it through fear, manipulation, lies, and every other wrong maneuver. So I think that's what we're seeing in this world system. And everybody, the people that are controlling it are doing it because they're capitalizing. They're incentivizing everybody through bribes. You know, the people at the top are all getting bribed. They're all getting something out of it.
Which I have to add, I follow some fashion influencers on Instagram.
I heard you say that before, yeah.
For some inspiration. And I thought it was very interesting how all of a sudden through this pandemic, they were posting, work outfits, casual outfits, all these different outfits. And then all of a sudden they're promoting the vaccine. And on Instagram, if it's a paid ad, you have to write at the bottom, paid by or sponsored by. And so all of a sudden I'm seeing on all these Instagram posts, paid by the CDC, paid by the CDC, sponsored by the CDC. Right. And I'm like, the CDC is paying influencers where their market is fashion. And their market is sharing corporate career work outfits and all of these things. And now they're getting paid to share vaccinations.
That's the whole thing. There was finances and bribes and all this behind everything, or we would not be where we're at. All these news outlets and everybody, besides buying into the Kool-Aid and having some kind of religious drive to do all these things, everybody's been paid off. And that again, it's God doesn't do that, and people that use his name to do that are outside his spirit and will. But the world, that's how they operate. And all the people that I feel bad for that have bought in and they've sold it. It's been the perfect sell, right? They've appealed to people's sense of goodness, of people's sense of morality. So people have bought into this because they feel it's the right thing to do. But if you dig a little deeper now at this point with all the data, they're virtual signaling. And it's almost like the Pharisees of old, that they're dependent on their morality, their collective morality. We're the good guys. And they don't care hell or high water because the numbers around them agree. So it doesn't matter what's right or wrong. They're just in it for the morality, the virtual signaling, and the empowerment that it gives them. And I think that's a lot of what drives and keeps this thing alive. So it's insane to see. I can't. It's hard to understand, but when you break it down, you can see all those pieces fall together.
It makes me wonder how many celebrities think like you and I do, but are just too afraid to say something because of the backlash and with their platform.
I think that's a big factor. It's amazing to me how many people reach out. I had a grandma reach out, and I fear for a lot of older people. What can I do? I'm worried about my kids, my grandkids. I see all this happening, and I always try to encourage them. I say, pray. You know, I can't remember if it was Hannah when Jesus was born, and she was fasting and praying day and night. And there's a call for that of service. But I also tell them, I said, you could still write your legislators, you can call them, you can get involved, just letting your elected officials know how you feel. And it holds a lot of weight being, you're an older citizen that has lived and had experience. And I get a lot of them say, I'm scared. I don't want to do that. I don't want to put my neck out. I don't want anybody to know. And I think that fear is so real. And that's been the manipulation and the psyop of media, where anybody who sticks their head out, pays a price, and that's meant to send the message to everybody else. But it discourages me for a moment, but I have no choice but to keep going forward. But it's discouraging and disheartening because people know how serious this is. They know how deep and dark it is, and yet they're not willing to stand up. And I question for Christians that hold that line, that they're not willing to stand up and they're fearing for their life. I question their faith. And at best it's lukewarm, but at worst, is there any real faith? Is God really in control in your life? Do you really believe he's sovereign? Because if you do, and these things are evil, Ephesians 5:1 is staring you in the face, and you need to stand up, and in whatever capacity you can, in love, in truth, you need to start speaking the truth. Because if we all stood up, this would all change. But I think at the root of it is selfishness, whether it's selfishness to be self-preserving, whether it's selfishness to keep your status, your jobs, your money, whatever it is you're fearful of losing as a result. I think it's selfishness, and Christ calls us to pick up our cross and follow him. And I think that applies here. And I think when the churches and the leaders and the people that are not taking a stand, especially with all the data and all it doesn't take much to figure it out anymore. I think it's really sad commentary on people.
So how do you stay strong in your faith? And what can we do as Christians to fight back against this evil?
I take to heart Christ, I think in John 15, where he says, you could do nothing without me, remain in the vine, and you'll bear much fruit. And he'll also prune, if you bear fruit, he'll prune you. I think keeping that connection and that relationship, it's really hard sometimes. I find myself too busy, too engrossed, trying to look at all this material that's coming out through a fire hose constantly, and constantly keeping involved. but I think you have to make time to stay in the Word, to stay in prayer. And I know me, before I had an opportunity to really solidify my faith, and to know without a shadow of a doubt that God is in charge in his sovereignty. And I think just acknowledging that in your daily life and reminding yourself of that when things don't go the way you think they should go, when you can't make sense of everything going on, just being reminded of that. I think in the Psalms, he says, I would start to despair, but then I would remember. And that, I think, is, we walk by faith, not by sight. And I think as you stay connected, you stay in prayer, God will lead you to the opportunities. And then it's a matter of having the courage to take that stand. And I think once you do, in a little way, sometimes it's just getting engaged, a call to action, writing a letter, supporting a ministry or an organization like CCDF that is on the front lines. I think that's a start. And coming out to meetings, if you're in our areas, but just getting involved, going out to rallies. I mean, those who are on the front lines, it gets really tiring. And what gives us the energy to keep going is to see people standing up, to see others take that first step. It makes it worthwhile. But I can't depend on others. I can't depend on people. I can't depend on anything else. I just depend on Jesus, and I go to the well, and that gives me the strength to keep fighting. And sometimes it gets really hard. But you know what? The greater the pressure, the greater the result. I mean, it really pushes you deeper into faith. And I'm grateful. Everything turns out to be a blessing. And Romans 8:28 comes to life.
I'm curious to know, how did you grow up? Did you grow up Christian? Did you always grow up with your view on politics?
No. Interestingly enough, I was baptized into the Catholic faith. As my mom and dad, they divorced very early. My mom ended up becoming a Jehovah's Witness for years. There were a lot of biblical things there that didn't match up, and she came to that because she really loved the Word and loved God with all her heart, and she was trying to understand it. So we left there, and we ended up in a deeper cult. That would be a whole conversation in itself. But it really went deep, and I had to study my way out of it. And then that put me on a path where I wanted to understand belief systems in general. And I studied all world religions. I went to temples. I talked to imams. I traveled, and I really was fascinated by religions, what people believe, what the results of those beliefs were, where they started, who started them, why they started them. And I found a lot of self-interest in a lot of the origins of a lot of these religions. And then I went out there, I got involved in the New Age. It's amazing the stuff that's out there once you open yourself up to it. But it all led me back to Scripture and studying a prophecy, and I was amazed at the Word of God, how it tells you what was going to happen and how it happened, not just like a Nostradamus where they have to change the words and maybe he said this and people still follow, or Edgar Casey, the sleeping prophet, where he had all these different prophecies that never come true, but the Bible's prophecies came true, and when you dig in, you're like amazed. And it brought me back to the Word of God, and that started my journey in a real relationship and faith, and trust. And politically, I really had a hard time, being that I was always socially active. I went through a lot of addictions, so I had a heart open to people that were troubled, and all these different things, because I've been through it, and I didn't find an opening within the Republican as I saw them. I looked at it, so I leaned more liberal, and more social justice. I would say I was always fighting for workers' rights, and it was amazing to me, like when I saw my life come together and I was able to make a decent living, it changes your life. And I worked hard, and prior to that, I was working hard, not making enough money. So I really had the corporatism really turned me off. But as you know, I read it somewhere. Somebody said, in your 20s, if you're not a liberal, something's wrong with you, and after you're 40, if you're not a conservative, something's really wrong with you. And I think as you begin to understand all these things, and you realize it's not a political party, you got to stand on the issues and the principles. and you have to vote your biblical convictions. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that are self-serving in those spheres as well. So I didn't grow up in these things. I didn't grow up, leaning Republican. But right now, you have no choice because they've gone off the deep end on the other side, and we have communism breathing down our necks. Some weird hybrid form of it, but communism nonetheless, and Marxist, which is everything I'm against. But no, I didn't start there. And that's a whole journey. I could open up a can of worms on that, but
politics hit me hard in the face when I graduated college, because you're in that young 20s age group and everybody wants your attention. Everyone wants your vote. And so you're in this interesting environment where you have all these different people vying for your attention, right? And which way do I go? Who do I listen to? Who's telling the truth? I mean, that's something that I even struggle with, knowing my political beliefs today, is who's telling the truth? Because even now I'm watching the news and I'm like, is this even true?
And I think that's part of the, I think the term was hyper normalization of uncertainty, where nobody really knows what the truth is. And I'll touch on this, like Q, when it came out. Somebody sent me the Q thing, and I looked at it and I said, well, it's interesting. And there was a lot of truths in there that I knew were true, but there were all these grandiose claims and prophecies that were going to happen from direct insight, and none of it came true. So I just dismissed it and realized, but there was a big, who did it, I don't know, but it was a big effort, concerted effort. That wasn't one guy in a basement coming up with all this stuff. There was some very intelligent people and some really strategy, and it was meant to make people look crazy who had any concerns that were wrapped up in there. That's my observation. So it's all meant to keep everybody confused. And in other words, if you believe anything, well, you're one of these guys, right. So you're just crazy. And all these, and another aspect I would say is the people that are so passionate to win your vote over as a young person, they really believe in what they're doing, and people hitch that space in their heart that's only meant for God. They hitch it onto an agenda, onto something, and they feel like they're doing something. So they come with a religious fervor, and that's very powerful to win young people over.
It's interesting that you mentioned Q, because my dad's going to laugh at this when he listens, but growing up, I'm very thankful that my parents gave me the ability to do research and figure out what I believed for myself. They never pushed their opinions or beliefs on me, but they guided me to come to the conclusion on my own, which allowed me to take ownership over my life.
And it showed a lot of trust in you.
Right.
And I think that's the problem with it. Parents don't instill and trust in their children, so their children feel like they have to depend on somebody else, and they end up depending on the loudest voices. But sorry.
No. But there was a little bit of humoring I did with my dad with politics, because he was into all that Q stuff, and I would laugh and listen. And now, though, I'm the one calling my dad, being like, Dad, did you hear this? Did you see this? So it's funny how the table has turned, and now, my dad and I are having these serious political conversations.
And it's nice, right? It's nice when you could, with your loved ones and your immediate family, if they agree with you, as opposed to so many families are being torn apart right now. For years, you asked me about my background. My dad was always a staunch conservative, over the top. And he would tell me all these things that I remember I would disagree with him or bring up a point that disagreed. And he would slam his hands on the table and his veins would come out of his neck. I'm disappointed in you, But years later, I find out even though his delivery wasn't always right, he was right. And he would always tell me, you give these people a hand, they're going to take your arm, they're going to destroy everything, they're communists. And he'd go on. And all of a sudden I start seeing all these things. He was right. And it's so great to be able to talk with our parents especially, and have that bond there.
You mentioned something previously when we were having a conversation, that you had a conversation with somebody and they were expecting you to be a high-level executive at Disney with how much you've gotten done regarding the vaccine mandate. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's a David and Goliath message where people are expecting you to be an executive. And here you are saying, I'm a server who had a conviction and got A, B, and C done for my community.
Yeah, and I don't ever think in terms of like that. It's funny. I've always been comfortable in my own skin, But it's amazing how many times I've been involved, or even when I was in the dating world, when somebody would meet me and like, well, what do you do? I'm a server, I'm a DJ. And you'd see their friend pulling them away, because they were a lawyer or in the medical profession or something. You don't want that guy. But I'm comfortable in my own skin, and God has, worked all things together for good. But it was interesting. So I went to CPAC, and a friend of mine got me tickets, and we had an amazing time. And then I got invited to a party that was done by the America Project. So I was there, and somebody an activist that I had been working with on different issues with legislators, introduced me to this couple of people, and I had no idea who they were. They looked really familiar, and I'm sitting there talking to them, and I had to finally ask them, like, well, who are you guys and what do you do? And they looked at each other and they looked at me like I should know, because when you're in that environment like of CPAC, everybody knows everybody, right. It's a lot of groupie kind of things going on, and I had no idea. And so they start to talk to me, and he looked at me and says, so what do you do for Disney? After my friend Fran had told him everything, I had done and been involved and how I've been helping out politically. And I said, I'm a server. And he said, server, what do you mean? I said, server, like waiter? And I said, yeah. And he just started belly laughing. He's just laughing. He couldn't stop. He goes, that's amazing. He said, man, you bring me a lot of joy. I said, what do you mean? He goes, you must be driving them crazy that a server took a stand and gave them the headache that you did. And he says, that's just wonderful. He just really loved that, and he was touched by it, and he was really heartwarmed after that. And every time I saw him in the crowd, he's like, you go. So that was cool, and that brings me back to everybody has it. You don't have to be somebody. It's amazing what God could do with a surrendered life and with somebody who's resolved and convicted.
I think that's so inspirational. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it up, is to let our listeners know that you don't have to have a specific title or work at a specific career to make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's amazing. Another great thing about stepping up and speaking out is all the amazing people and opportunities. Just being here with you guys here today talking, and just getting to know Steve and CCDF and the whole family. It's been amazing. And just around the country, I've done so many things, got involved with the DC mandate rally, had a small part to play there, then actually done some really cool things, getting involved and just being in the room with all those people and doctors and many times like that. So you never know, it becomes an adventure, and people are missing out when they don't take a stand.
So what does the future look like for you in regards to CCDF?
Well, Steve has invited me to be an executive director and lift up Osceola County. I didn't see myself in that role. I tried to talk my way out of it, gave him some really good reasons why I think, I got a storied past prior to Christ. And he's really an amazing guy of faith, and he looks at the heart as well. And with his experience, I have an amazing amount of respect, and if he sees something, I trust that. And I also believe in what CCDF is doing. I mean, it's a great plan. It's a great organization. It's a great people. So I definitely want to be a part of it. I still don't know how the qualifications, but I think he just seems to think, the main qualifications that he sees in me is my fight, my heart. So I'm going to go forward with CTDF, and Lord willing, we're going to lift up Osceola County. And my hardest thing is going to be to focus, because I want to swing at everybody.
Well, lastly, to wrap this podcast up, do you have any words of encouragement for our listeners? Yes.
God is in control. I hear a lot of people call me that are, I hear tears, I hear frustration. It's overwhelming when you look at what's going on. I think it's an impossible mission. I don't think we have a chance in heck to win. But I do, because I know God is in control. He's sovereign. I've seen him do miracles. I believe in the miracles of the Bible. I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it in a lot of lives. And I see him weaving. I just seen so many things in my life, and how I've been instrumental in doing so many things. And I see these connections happening, and it's just amazing. And I think if you'll trust that, and you can be part of the solution, and regardless, to be on the right side of things. I mean, I think of it as this: if you were in Nazi Germany or in communist Russia coming, would you really want to have that regret all of eternity, that you were on the wrong side of the issues? Or would you want to know that you took a stand for the right thing at all cost? And I think that's at the heart of the matter. I think, you know, for one, if you don't have Jesus, you don't have anything, and your efforts are pretty vain, I think. But if you do, I think you really, all of eternity, you're going to be grateful you made the right decision, and you're going to be grateful for all the people that you know, we get in our day-to-day lives, and a lot of it's meaningless. But when you get involved in something like this, standing for truth and standing for encouraging people and fighting for people, that's meaningful, and you make a difference. I look at what CCDF has done recently with the books, all these books. If anybody looks at what's in those books that were on the shelves for kids to look at, and I say that's like leaving a loaded gun on the shelf, waiting to see what a kid's going to do with it. And to see CCDF find a way to get those books off the shelf and to go through that process, that's meaningful, that's impactful, that's going to change who knows how many kids' lives that's going to change. And just to shining a light on it and expose a lot of darkness, even on a local level, I think is big. So I encourage people to get involved.
Thank you for that. I know you brought notes. Is there anything else that you'd like
I don't know.
to touch on?
I look at a lot of notes. Let's see. No, look at JP's. You know, I was going to touch on the World Economic Forum. There is a video by JP. I can't remember his last name. He's a comedian, but unfortunately his stuff doesn't sound like comedy anymore. It's kind of tragic, but he tries to bring sarcasm to it. But he did something recently looking for JP, World Economic Forum. The material in there, he pieced it together nicely, but it's horrific when you really look at what they say. And one of the things that they're talking about is they never had the ability in the past to control people because they couldn't biohack people, but they have the technology now. That sounds a lot like what they're doing. And he ties it in with even all these other world systems, communism and Nazism, and they're somehow proud and saying we can do it. And they talk like if you know, people's sovereignty and free will, that's a thing of the past. And you hear people, graduates from the World Economic Forum like Trudeau, who thanked communist China's leader and said his system is he admires that system of being able to pivot that economy on a dime. These are some really evil people in the guise of social good. And I think seeing something like what JP pieced together there is quick and easy to look at and to share, but it really gives you a real good look. And then I would encourage people that once you see, don't bury your eyes and don't bury your head in the sand and try to unsee it. Do something about it.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you, Lindsay, for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and hopefully I didn't overtalk, but I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Listeners, if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or whatever platform you're listening on. Remember, freedom is in your DNA.